Good morning, everyone. Would ask you, our guests, to please take their seats. Senator Capito and I are happy to welcome you all. We've been on recess for a while. It took me a while to find this room, but I finally wandered into the right hearing room. So, it's good to be back. Today's hearing is our committee's first hearing since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the most significant investment to combat climate change in our nation's history. And I'd like to take a moment to discuss the significance of this law before we turn to the hearing itself. This historic law is going to deliver nearly $370 billion in climate and clean energy funding that will put our nation on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. This is a critical down payment on reaching the President's goals on cutting emissions in half by the end of this decade and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. These investments will also significantly reduce emissions that impact our nation's air quality, helping all Americans breathe a little easier. Passing this law could not have come at a more critical time. As many of you know, this week, heavy rainfall flooded areas, streets, and highways surrounding Providence, Rhode Island. Temperatures in Sacramento, California broke all-time records amid a historic heat wave in that state. It's quite clear that climate crisis is here, and this extreme weather is impacting the air that we breathe. Currently, there are nearly 70 wildfires burning across this country. Along with the destruction that wildfires bring, the smoke they release contains particulate matter and other air pollutants that pose a threat to human health. Smoke doesn't just threaten nearby communities, but also downwind communities as well. We know that smoke from wildfires in the West has reached as far as our states here on the East Coast. Some people say that we're at the end of America's tailpipe, and some days I fully agree with that. As these wildfires become more frequent and severe, so do the emissions that they create. The health risks from exposures to this pollution are even greater for disadvantaged communities, including rural communities, which are often more vulnerable to wildfires and the resulting air pollution. That's why we've made mitigating the climate and health risks from wildfires eligible for funding under our Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grants Program in the Inflation Reduction Act. This new program provides $3 billion in grants and technical assistance for mitigating environmental issues in disadvantaged communities. And that brings me to Senator Merkley's two pieces of legislation that we're considering today, along with several others. The Smoke Ready Communities Act would create a grant program to support communities in preparing for and responding to the potential health risks from harmful air emissions that emanate from wildfires. The Smoke Planning and Research Act would support community planning and research activities on the effects of smoke emissions from wildfires on human health. I look forward to hearing more about these bills shortly from Senator Merkley and our witnesses. Before we do, however, let me turn to another piece of legislation that we're going to examine today, and that is the Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports Act, also known as RPM Act. And this legislation seeks to clarify that race cars do not need to meet Clean Air Act emission requirements. I commend Senator Kelly for his leadership on this legislation, as well as our good friend Senator Burr, the original sponsor of the bill. We can all agree that race car drivers shouldn't face liability for the emissions of their cars that are used solely for organized competition. Fortunately, as EPA has informed us, the agency has never sought to assert that individual drivers are liable under the Clean Air Act. But as a $10 million civil penalty announced last week makes clear, bad actors are attempting to exploit the racing community to sell devices that tamper with pollution control for on-road use. And while I do have concerns that this legislation is a solution without a problem, I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today and seeing if we can reach an agreement on language to clarify this point without inadvertently creating new uncertainties or opportunities for litigation in the law. And finally, the fourth bill we're considering today is Senator Thune's legislation, the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act. This legislation would restrict EPA's ability to ensure permits under the Clean Air Act for emissions from certain agricultural activities, especially those relating to biological processes for livestock farming. As we discuss this legislation today, it's worth noting that EPA already refrains from issuing such permits. And why is that? One reason is the inclusion of language similar to Senator Thune's bill in annual appropriations legislation for several years now. That means the decision on whether this restriction is necessary is up to Congress each year, not the EPA. So doing so provides Congress with important flexibility. And with that, again, we want to thank our panel of witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from each of you as part of our discussion. Before we do, though, let me first turn to our ranking member, Senator Capito, for her opening statement. Senator Capito, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
And you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Carper. It's good to be back, and it's nice to see the members of the committee. I would also, before I begin, note that Senator Burr, who is one of the main co-sponsors of one of the bills, the RPM Act, could not make it today, so I would ask unanimous consent to include a written statement from Senator Byrd.
Without objection.
And Senator Tillis is also on the statement. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us here today, and I look forward to hearing from each of you. We're here to consider 4 bills: the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act, the Recognizing Protection of Motorsports Act, the Smoke Ready Communities Act, and Smoke Planning and Research Act. These bills relate to EPA's authority on issues spanning from livestock to racing vehicles to wildfire smoke. I'm more interested to hear about Senator Merkley's bill, the Smoke Ready Communities Act, and the Smoke Planning and Research Act. But I do want to highlight that EPA has existing authority to fund wildfire research, including through the Science to Achieve Results STAR program. That program has provided research funds for universities for wildfire research, which appears to be something that Senator Merkley's bill, the Smoke Planning and Research Act, would reauthorize in a separate, and I'd like to understand how, if there's any a duplication there. In 2021, EPA awarded $9 million in grant funding for researchers to develop approaches and strategies to reduce the risks of smoke from wildfire and prescribed harm. And through the Democrats' what I call a reckless tax and spending spree that we just saw last month, EPA has been provided with excessive additional funding and authorities. EPA, and the chairman mentioned this, received funding for air monitoring, which can be used for wildfires, as well as $3 billion grant that can award funding to mitigate climate and health risks from wildfire events. I question the need for even greater increase in EPA power and appropriations in light of the recent spending. As we consider the other topics before us today, I want to thank Chairman Carper for agreeing to consider 2 bipartisan bills during this hearing, the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act and the RPM Act. These 2 bills are narrowly tailored to provide clear relief and certainty to critical American groups that could suffer outsized costs from EPA regulation, farmers and ranchers, and motorsports enthusiasts, which are rampant in my state. The regulatory threat is real, and we have already seen this administration take a very expansive view of EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act when evaluating the energy sector. The first bill I'll talk about is the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act, which would ensure EPA cannot establish a new cow tax and would prohibit EPA from requiring Clean Air Act permits related to livestock emissions. Farmers and ranchers are on the front line of dealing with rising prices, including higher costs of fertilizer, feed, fuel, and equipment that are vital to their operation. Enacting Senator Thune's bipartisan, straightforward bill, which is co-sponsored by Senator Kelly, a member of this committee, and thank you for that, Senator Bozeman, and Senator Sinema, could codify a narrow exemption for livestock. I would note that Majority Leader Schumer himself supported Senator Thune's bill when it was introduced back in 2009. I'm also pleased to speak in support of necessary relief for race car enthusiasts and their supporting industries. I have proudly supported Senator Burr's RPM Act since it was first proposed. This legislation, it seems so simple to me, as introduced, has broad bipartisan support, including on this committee. In addition to myself, 4 other committee members are supportive. Senator Kelly, and thank you for that support, Senator Inhofe, Senator Ernst, and Senator Sullivan are also co-sponsors. In total, the bill has 32 co-sponsors, including 11 Democrat co-sponsors. Back in 2017, when I was chair of the Subcommittee of Clean Air and Nuclear Safety, we held a hearing on the RPM Act. As we heard then, and we will hear again today, Americans all over the country enjoy the hobby of modifying vehicles into race cars. The RPM Act would clarify that vehicles to be used solely for competition are not to be treated like the cars that drive on our nation's roads. Congress never intended for cars that have been modified from street use to race car track use to be regulated. This legislation would provide a narrow exemption, again, narrow, to ensure that small businesses that help hobbyists who transition their vehicles into race cars that are not driven on the road and cannot be driven on the road are not unfairly punished or targeted through EPA enforcement, because that was never the intent of this Congress. I'm glad that we are hearing about these bills today, and I hope to learn more from our witnesses. So thank you again for holding the hearing. And Senator Merkley,
Thank you very much, Senator
I think is
Capito.
going to take the gavel, right?
My imaginary gavel.
Here
right
it is. Here it is.
Well, I'm delighted we're looking at this set of bills today, and we're next going to turn to Senator Kelly to make a statement about recognizing the Protection of Motorsports Act, or RPM, as Senator Capito referred to, of which he is an original co-sponsor. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by saying that I appreciate Chairman Carper's willingness to hold a hearing today on the Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports Act, or RPM Act. Racing is a very important thing to many Arizonans, and it's part of our state's legacy. In my hometown of Tucson, Arizona, we have a street called Speedway Boulevard. I don't live more than maybe a half a mile from Speedway. And the name of the street dates back to 1911, before Arizona was a state, when the road hosted the first ever auto race in southern Arizona. And records from the time indicate that the race was so popular that more than half of the population of Tucson attended. Motorsports continue to be an important thing to thousands of amateur racers in Arizona, and the more than 100,000 Arizonans who attend motorsports events each and every year, including me. I've often gone down to the NHRA, race outside of Phoenix. But that also includes my wife, who raced motorcycles herself on a track in Arizona when she was in her 20s. And when she was in Congress, my wife, Gabby Giffords, was a part of the House Motorcycle Caucus, and she would regularly ride motorcycles near Patagonia and in southern Arizona. She still owns that motorcycle today, which will turn 50, not her, but the motorcycle, will turn 50 years old this year. The RPM Act will help provide some certainty to Arizona's amateur racers and auto mechanics from EPA regulations, which could harm their ability to enjoy the hobby, And the goal of this bill, and the reason that I support it, is to provide a narrow exemption to Clean Air Act regulations which govern vehicle emissions, to allow those amateur racers to improve the performance of their vehicle without worrying that they are breaking the law. Now, I recognize that this bill needs work in order for it to be included in a committee markup. And I agree that we need to ensure that any amendments to the Clean Air Act preserve EPA's authority to go after bad actors, such as folks who sell and install defeat devices to illegally modify emissions controls on street vehicles. And I know that Our staffs have been discussing a potential path forward with EPW committee staff, and I want to say how grateful I am for Chairman Carper's engagement and shared commitment to a path forward. I also want to be sure to acknowledge the leadership of Senator Burr, who has been a champion for this legislation for years, as well as our other co-leads on this bill, Senators Tester, Manchin, Tillis, and Ernst. And I hope this hearing is another step forward toward the goal of finding a compromise where we can provide certainty to the racers, to the mechanics and retailers who are committed to following the law while continuing to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Kelly. And can you hear the roar of the racetrack from your home?
I cannot, but I tell you, there is nothing like standing next to a Top Fuel dragster just feet away when that thing takes off. It's kind of like reminds me of being in the rocket ship.
I was thinking as you were speaking about the sport of quarter midget racing, which is racing in which youth participate in. I raced quarter midgets many years when I was growing up, and wouldn't want to be arrested for violating clean air laws. So thank you. We're now going to turn to our first panel, which is our esteemed colleague from the state of South Dakota, Senator John Thune. He is the lead sponsor of one of the pieces of legislation we're examining today, the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act. Senator Thune, welcome to the committee, and you can proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Capito for holding today's legislative hearing to consider the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act. I also want to thank the South Dakota Farm Bureau Federation President and American Farm Bureau Federation Vice President, Scott Vanderwool, for being here and for his testimony on this important legislation. I've long been concerned with efforts to impose onerous regulations and costly permit fees on animal emissions and the negative effect it would have on U.S. agricultural producers' ability to continue providing a safe and abundant food supply for our nation and the world. Regulating animal emissions could ultimately lead to higher food costs for consumers who are already facing increased food prices. And contrary to the story that is being pushed by opponents of the beef industry, beef production is directly responsible for only a tiny fraction of U.S. emissions. Cattle actually play an important role in managing pasture lands that sequester vast amounts of carbon. And on top of that, it's become clear that with certain feed additives, as well as then capturing and utilizing the energy potential of their waste using biodigesters, it's possible to significantly reduce cattle emissions, making the demonization of beef even more wrong-headed. And this isn't limited to cattle production. Regulating animal emissions would negatively affect the entire livestock sector, including poultry producers in places like Delaware and dairy producers in places like West Virginia. To address this, I introduced the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act along with Senator Sinema. The Livestock Regulatory Protection Act, which is also co-sponsored by Senators Bozeman and Kelly, would prevent the Environmental Protection Agency from imposing emissions regulations relating to the biological processes of livestock. I actually introduced this bill years ago with the Democrat leader. This legislation was included in annual funding bills on a bipartisan basis for a number of years after the Democrat leader and I first introduced it. Unfortunately, Democrats have omitted this important protection in their recent spending proposals and has had to be secured in final spending bills. Passing this legislation would provide livestock producers long-term certainty that their livelihoods will not be compromised by regulatory overreach. So I want to thank you for holding today's hearing, and I want to urge this committee to swiftly advance this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Thune. And now we'll turn to two witnesses related to my bills, and I'll make my statement on that. And then we're going to turn to another witness related to the racing car bill. And so why don't we have the second panel come to their seats right now. Welcome. Good to have all of you here. And I'll address Senate Bill 2661, the Smoke Ready Communities Act, and 2421, the Smoke Planning and Research Act. Communities are on the front lines across the country in wildfire country, and the West is burning, and thus much more effects of wildfire smoke on agriculture, on our workers who work outdoors, certainly on our communities. And as a result, we need to address some of these increased challenges, and these two bills are designed to do that. The deadly wildfires are once again blazing across my home state and creating very poor quality smoke. A lot of people end up in the hospital because of the aggravation of asthma. So these two bills are very timely. Even as we sit here today, the Double Creek Fire in northeastern Oregon has burned over 43,000 acres in the last week. The Rum Creek Fire in Josephine County has burned over 19,000 acres, including homes and other buildings. And when you have fire, you have a lot of smoke, and it has a big impact on business, a big impact on the economy, big impact on tourism, big impact on outdoor life. There was an expose on the changes Pacific Crest Trail that I was just reading this morning, where vast sections have been burned. The landscape looks entirely different than it did 10 to 15 years ago. And my wife, Mary, and I have hiked sections of the PCT and seen this firsthand while dodging forest fires and having to leave the trail because of those forest fires. And I can tell you, when you're out in the wilderness and you're out of cell phone contact and you're not quite sure where the fires are and you smell smoke, you start to feel very, very uncomfortable. Because of the fires raging across our state, the Department of Environmental Quality for the state of Oregon has issued air quality advisories this past weekend for many counties in Oregon where air quality levels are in the unhealthy category. 2 years ago, the Labor Day fires struck our state. They burned 6 towns to ashes. It looked like they had been firebombed in a war. I traveled 600 miles in my state and never got out of the smoke. I don't know that that's ever happened anywhere in the West. You could travel so far and be completely in the smoke. I went from the northern border to the southern border and back again. And last summer's bootleg fire sent smoke clouds traveling from Oregon to here, Washington, D.C., 2,800 miles. So this is not just something that affects a community, say, a mile or two from a fire. So many people being impacted. The American Lung Association's 2022 State of the Air report notes that 63 million people now live in counties with failing grades for daily particle pollution, 9 million more people than when they released their report a year earlier. 24 of the 25 worst counties for short-term particle pollution were in the western states because of the wildfires, 24 out of 25 of the worst counties. Now, we have had some progress. I created a $4 million EPA grant program in the Interior Appropriations Bill to support local efforts to address wildfire smoke hazards. I'm proposing increasing that funding. And through a program that here is referred to congressionally directed spending, in Oregon, we call it community-initiated projects, because the idea is the communities initiate the project, what they need, and we fight for them. Senator Wyden and I fight for them. And out of that came the Center for Wildfire Smoke Research and Practice at the University of Oregon to help address the need for Oregon communities to be better prepared for wildfire smoke events. And thanks to provisions in the IRA, like the Environmental and Climate Justice Block Grants, and the money for air pollution monitoring and reducing air pollution at public schools, we're going to make some much-needed investments. But as important as those steps are, there is much more that needs to be done. The Smoke Ready Communities Act will establish a grant program for air pollution control agencies to develop and implement programs to monitor and communicate with the public about air quality conditions created by wildfire smoke. It will equip public buildings with air filtration system. Many people have heard of heat centers where you escape the intensified heat. And we've had heat of 115 degrees in the city of Portland, something I never thought I would witness in my lifetime. It was very rare to have a day over 90, and then it was rare to have a day over 100, but nobody predicted kind of Death Valley temperatures to be in the Willamette Valley. And equip public gatherings, public buildings with filtration systems, protect for harmful events, and store and distribute N95 masks to be distributed. The Smoke Planning and Research Act would direct the EPA to create 4 centers of excellence for wildfire smoke. And essentially, the pilot project for that is the project at the University of Oregon. The centers will conduct research on the effects of wildfire smoke on public health, as well as ways in which communities can better respond to its impacts. The bill would direct the EPA to develop and distribute ways to reduce exposure to smoke and to reduce adverse health effects of smoke emissions, along with increasing the quality of smoke monitoring and prediction. And it would create a grant program to help the development and implementation of collaborative community plans for confronting the impacts of wildfire smoke. Both of these bills have received support from organizations that pay attention to the health and well-being of our communities and the people who live in them. And at this time, I ask unanimous consent for submitting for the record letters of support for bills S-2661 and S-2421, including a letter from the American Lung Association. Hearing no objections, so approved. With the threat and frequency of wildfires continuing to grow every year, communities are continuing to confront these dangers. When some of these intensive fires occurred, really, they've been steadily growing over the last 20 years, but over the last 5 to 10 years, been enormous change. We really realize how much more we need to do. As the wildfires burn, the smoke fills our skies, it degrades our air quality, it threatens our health, it threatens our economic well-being, and we need to do all we can, and these 2 bills will help in that. So I really appreciate the chairman and ranking member for holding a hearing on these 2 bills today. And now I have the pleasure of introducing a fellow Oregonian, Cass Mosley, welcome, who can not only personally attest to the challenges we face in the state from the wildfires and the smoke they produce, but also share her academic experience and her expertise about why these bills are critical. She is a member of the University of Oregon community for over 2 decades. She serves as a vice provost for academic operations and strategy. She is a research professor with the Institute for Sustainable Environment and a senior policy advisor in the school's Ecosystem Workforce Program. She is a recognized expert in natural resource policy, including forest, wildfire, bioenergy, rural development policy, and federal land management, and she has studied the changing face of Western wildfire management with a particular focus on how natural resource policies affect rural communities, businesses, and workers, including immigrant forest workers. We're thrilled to have such a knowledgeable and accomplished fellow Oregonian here to address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Merkley, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the committee for holding this really important hearing today. Driven by climate change and a century of wildfire suppression, wildfires are growing in size and severity across the American West. Wildfire smoke is rapidly increasing public health risk, affecting not only rural communities, as we've discussed, that are located near these fires, but increasingly in major urban centers, hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Exposure to fine particulate matter contained in smoke is associated with many different negative outcomes. And people with respiratory disease, the young, elderly, and pregnant women are particularly vulnerable to these risks. Households and individuals need to be prepared to act quickly when smoke arrives, and yet many lack the information about the practical steps they can take to keep themselves safe. A central strategy for reducing smoke exposure is to go indoors. But for those who are unhoused or whose livelihood involves outdoor work, this may be difficult to achieve. Moreover, houses and other buildings, particularly in low-income communities, may lack the filtration systems and the insulation to effectively protect against smoke intrusions, especially these long-duration events, such as the one that Senator Merkley referred to earlier that I, too, lived indoors for 2 weeks around. Special attention is needed to ensure that both medically and socially vulnerable populations can limit their exposure to wildfire smoke. Today, I want to suggest 5 key ingredients to foster smoke-ready communities. First, we need to address the underlying drivers of increasing wildfire smoke. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we can slow climate-driven wildfire. In addition, we need hazardous fuels reduction using mechanical treatments and prescribed fire in places where treatments will change fire behavior. I want to thank this committee for its leadership in the passage of both the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. These are historic laws that make substantial investment in wildfire risk reduction. In addition, as has been already mentioned, the IRA's environmental and climate justice block grants create an opportunity for the EPA to address many of the needs I discussed today. Second, we need to invest in community planning and preparation. Communities need to be ready to launch measures during smoke events, and success requires bringing together agencies that work on public health, air quality, along with social service delivery organizations and those who understand wildfire. And they need to be creating locally relevant plans. Financial support will be important to the success of these in many low-income communities. The Smoke Planning and Research Bill anticipates these needs. Third, we need to improve indoor air quality to increase the ability of people to seek refuge from smoke. Low-income households may need assistance with enhanced air filtration and weatherization to improve their indoor air quality, and communities need buildings that can act as clean air shelters. Investing in school building retrofits, for example, can also limit educational disruption due to poor air quality. These kinds of activities, along with expanding access to personal protection equipment, are specifically contemplated in the Smoke Ready Communities Bill. Fourth, we need improved air quality monitoring, smoke forecasting, and communication tools to allow emergency managers and the public to better anticipate and act on smoke events. The EPA's Air Now resource is a valuable source of current smoke conditions. But we continue to need a denser network of high-quality smoke sensors and improved long-term forecasting. In addition to helping with smoke response, improved forecasting could also help increase prescribed fire, which is a key ingredient in reducing smoke over time. Finally, we need additional investments in research and development. For example, we need better techniques to empower vulnerable populations. We need decision support tools for emergency managers, better approaches to addressing competing indoor air quality needs, and improved understanding of the relative health effects of wildland and prescribed fire, and many, many other things. The Centers for Research Excellence that are proposed in the Smoke Planning and Research Bill would help create this new kind of capacity to address a number of these really critical challenges. So let me conclude again by thanking the committee for holding this really important hearing today and for your leadership in passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which should help tackle wildfires over time. And I look forward to answering any questions you all may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mosley. And we're now going to turn to Mr. Walk. Mr. Walk is the Clean Air, Climate, and Clean Energy Program Natural Resource Director at the Natural Resources Defense Council. He has spearheaded the organization's national cleanup advocacy before Congress and the courts and at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and before the public since year 2000. Before joining NRDC, he spent years working as an attorney in the EPA's Office of General Counsel, where he worked on issues related to air toxins, monitoring, and enforcement under the Clean Air Act. He is a graduate of Duke University and Harvard Law School, based here in Washington, D.C., and welcome very much.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. EPA has twin goals for balancing the Clean Air Act and the modification of motor vehicles into vehicles used exclusively for competition motorsports, letting racers race while also keeping tampered, high-polluting vehicles off our streets and highways. Those are reasonable goals. I agree. Let racers race. Unfortunately, most of the RPM Act of 2021 is unreasonable, unbalanced, and not narrow. The bill opens an exemption from anti-tampering and defeat device prohibitions in the Clean Air Act. The committee should reject this bill. The bill would make it easier for the defeat device industry to continue and actually increase the manufacture and sale of illegal defeat devices for use on America's public roads, polluting American communities and violating the Clean Air Act. Defeat devices on America's streets already are a national scandal. The RPM Act would make that problem much worse. The Trump EPA and now the Biden EPA have concluded that illegal defeat devices have been installed on more than 550,000 diesel pickup trucks in the last decade. In some states, as many as 20% of pickup trucks have illegal defeat devices. EPA concludes these pickup trucks release more than 570,000 tons of illegal excess smog-forming pollution. That's nearly 75% of the smog-forming pollution from all electric power plants in America. That is nearly 15 times more illegal smog pollution than the Volkswagen Dieselgate cheating scandal. This pollution causes asthma attacks in kids, bronchitis, lung cancer, and even premature death. In some states, illegal defeat devices on pickup trucks are causing as much as 66,000 tons of illegal excess smog pollution, just for one segment of the vehicle market. EPA has brought well over 120 successful enforcement cases against defeat device manufacturers and sellers since 2015. Some were criminal cases. EPA announced successful Clean Air Act enforcement cases against 6 more defeat device manufacturers and sellers just in the past 6 days. In enforcement cases by Republican and Democrats, defeat device companies tried repeatedly to hide behind false claims that they were selling their products to the racing community for use solely on racetracks. They were not. Defendants often were unable to show any of their products were used solely for motorsport competition. In one case, a company sold over 8,000 illegal defeat devices, and a federal judge found the defendant did not, quote, produce a single piece of evidence that a single one of its products had been used on motorsports vehicles. 2021 marketing data for the industry shows that the activity of dedicated racing vehicle makes up a mere 2% of total use for their products. The vast majority of consumer activities using their products are for running errands, pleasure driving, commuting, and work use, not on racetracks. Now the defeat device industry is promoting the RPM Act and hiding behind the racing community once again. EPA says that most defeat devices sold today are for motor vehicles used on public roads. EPA enforcement cases have addressed more than 1 million illegal defeat devices installed on street vehicles, not race cars. The RPM Act weakens the Clean Air Act to let defeat device makers and sellers claim it was not their purpose to sell defeat devices for street vehicles, backed up by completely inadequate evidence submitted by buyers, then have those defeat devices end up on hundreds of thousands of street vehicles. The industry would not need to show that any competition-only race cars use their defeat devices exclusively on racetracks. The Clean Air Act today does not let the industry get away with that. The RPM Act would. EPA has never brought a Clean Air Act enforcement case against a race car driver. It has no intention of doing so. If this committee nonetheless concludes that it is necessary to provide even greater assurances to the racing community, it should consider adopting a truly narrow amendment addressing just drivers and their motor vehicles used solely for formal racing competition, with appropriate safeguards to ensure decertified vehicles will not be operated on public streets. But the Clean Air Act should not be weakened or changed as it applies to the defeat device industry. Finally, I urge this committee not to advance S. 1475, the livestock exemption bill. It is unjustified, as my written testimony details. Moreover, a permanent exemption is unnecessary because Congress has adopted appropriate riders in recent years to accomplish the same outcome as the legislation, but importantly, only on an annual basis that allows yearly review to determine whether the exemption remains appropriate for the following year. S. 1475 dispenses with that and adopts a permanent harmful exemption. Thank you for the chance to testify.
Yeah. Mr. Walk, thank you for your testimony. Thanks. It's good to see you again. Thanks for coming back before committee. We're going to turn now to Mr. Brown, Mr. Antron Brown, a professional drag racer, for his testimony. You're living the life that a lot of kids, young boys, would like to be leading, I suspect. But this is certainly the first time I've introduced a professional racer before our committee, although I've been privileged to know a bunch of them. We have a big racetrack in Dover, NASCAR track in Dover for the Monster Mile, which I was once, Senator Capito, when my Town and Country minivan, 2001 Town and Country minivan, went over 500,000 miles. They opened up the track on a Monday morning, and we had just a great media event with me driving around the Monster Mile in my minivan at 500,000 miles. 500,000 miles. And I got to hold the starter flag out the window and drive as fast as I could go, and always rip my arm off. I did not let go. But today's hearing brings back some happy memories of that day. But Mr. Brown, we're delighted that you're here. It was very nice meeting you, and welcome. Please proceed.
Pleasure, pleasure. Thank you for everybody. Just let me share this moment with you and thank all the senators. And of course, my name's Antron Brown, and with me today I got my son Anson, my son Adler, my wife Billy Joe. My children include my daughter Ariana. You know, all of them have been racing literally for over 8 years. And Adler's our youngest, but she's only 14 years old. And I like to stress that racing's not our hobby. Racing is who we are. Racing has lifted our family from humble beginnings. Racing provides the opportunity to live the true American dream. American dream that was passed down from my grandfather to my dad, and from my dad to myself. And racing is our business, and racing is so much more than that. Racing is the educator, teaching me, my children, and team about STEM and how to use it in the real world. Racing instills persistence, which beats resistance each and every day. Racing has brought our family closer together. Racing has made us better people, better teammates, and better Americans. This is our story, and it's the stories of millions of Americans. I actually began riding motorcycles at the age of 4. Racing motorcycles and motocross.
Was that legal?
Yes, yes. As soon as they took the training wheels off, they was sitting there. My grandpa says, "Get it, boy." And and then my senior year in high school is when my dad helped me take our street legal motorcycle and make it into a race bike that we raced at numerous racetracks from Delaware to Pennsylvania to New Jersey and Pennsylvania, like literally like our 4-state area that we went racing as a family. But I stand before you today as a 3-time NHRA Top Fuel World Champion, won 70 national event titles, and I'm both a team owner and a driver of a new race team, AB Motorsports, that just started this year currently. To be clear, I am a small business owner, but my team is responsible for tuning my 11,000 horsepower race car that goes over 330 miles an hour in less than 3.6 seconds. That just powered AB Motorsports to win the biggest race of the year this last weekend at the Indianapolis U.S. Nationals in Indy, which is the mecca and the race capital of the world. I'm also told that I'm a teacher and a role model, but I'm proud to be a part of the NHRA's Youth Educational Service Program that used to be sponsored by the U.S. Army, which provides me the opportunity to speak to thousands of students across the country and have the chance to tell the story and educate them on our youth, on the importance on setting goals, working hard to achieve them, and the connection between racing and STEM learning. I'm fortunate to work with companies like Toyota North America, Mako Tools, Lucas Oil, Hankstofers, and many other research development companies to develop new technologies that ends up in motor vehicles that you and I drive every day, including EVs. Today, I'm all these things, but my story begins with the modification of a motorcycle into a dedicated race bike. Without the ability to convert a street-legal vehicle into a race vehicle, my dream of becoming a professional race car driver would have never happened. That's why I'm speaking in strong support of the RPM Act today. Racing is not just a business, it's a way of life, and I urge you to support for the hundreds and thousands of racers who compete using a motor vehicle that was modified and transported on a trailer to over 1,500 racetracks across the country. Most racers' entry into competition on tracks is done using cars, motorcycles, and trucks. It's simply more affordable to modify a motor vehicle than it is to buy a purpose-built race vehicle. I know, I spend lots of money. We must offer a cost-effective way to ensure the sport's inclusive and allows people from all different backgrounds to compete on the track. For business owners like myself and racers across the country, the investment of time, money, and resources requires a certainty in law. The RPM Act makes it legal for racers to convert motor vehicles into dedicated race vehicles. The RPM Act is about ensuring that racers can purchase parts they need to compete on the track. The bill does not protect companies that produce and sell products that defeat emission controls that are used on the street. We know that is really and totally illegal. The RPM Act does nothing to limit the EPA's ability to enforce against bad actors. The EPA has signaled that it does not plan to bring enforcement actions against the race industry and racers who compete in emission-modified vehicles. However, the agency maintains that it has the authority to do so and has pursued enforcement cases stating racers cannot make such modifications. Again, racers and business owners make substantial investments modifying their vehicles to improve safety, performance, and efficiency. Furthermore, the racing industry injects an estimated $100 billion into the economy, benefiting people and communities. Why not provide absolute certainty that they are protected by federal law? I appreciate the committee for taking up the RPM Act because I understand what's at stake. The RPM Act is one of the most bipartisan bills in Congress with more than 31 Senate co-sponsors, including 20 Republicans and 11 Democrats. This is about protecting the future of racing, which provides jobs and family entertainment in communities across the country. This is a passion for me and millions of Americans who love racing. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to testify before the committee today on something that is so extremely important to me. Thank you all so much for taking this time.
Mr. Round, thank you very much for joining us and for your testimony.
Thank you,
Good.
sir.
Very nice to meet you and your family.
Pleasure.
Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Vanderwall. Mr. Vanderwall is Vice President of the American Farm Bureau Federation and President of the South Dakota Farm Bureau. Everybody on this panel has a strong agricultural component in our states and in our economy. Delaware is certainly among those. So with that in mind, we especially welcome you today. Thanks. Please proceed.
Well, thank you, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito and members of the committee. We appreciate having this legislative hearing this morning on the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act. In addition to the two jobs that the chairman mentioned, I'm also a working family farmer from eastern South Dakota, where we raise corn, soybeans, and have a custom beef cattle feedlot. Keeping our farmers and ranchers in production is vital to our food security and to our national security. Farmers and ranchers work hard to keep food on our plates while continuing to make great strides in sustainability, which brings me to the topic of today's hearing. American agriculture accounts for approximately 10% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. That's far less than transportation, electricity generation, and other industry sectors. Farmers continue to produce more food, fiber, and energy more efficiently than ever before. Over 2 generations, we've nearly tripled our productivity without using more resources. In fact, we would have needed nearly 100 million more acres 30 years ago to match today's production levels. That's just amazing, and it's because of technology. More productive livestock operations allow ranchers, pork producers, poultry growers, egg producers, and dairy farmers to maintain their total contribution to greenhouse gas emissions at less than 4%. Now, like I said, innovation plays an important role, from methane digesters to advances in nutritional balance that lead to lower per unit greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll give you just a few statistics here. In fact, we've seen a 26% reduction in per unit emissions of greenhouse gases for our dairy industry, while milk production is up 48%. We have a 20% reduction by our swine producers with an 80% increase in pork production, and close to a 10% drop by our cattlemen and cattlewomen with an 18% increase in our production of beef. To continue to make improvements in carbon sequestration and emissions reductions, we need to increase investment in agricultural research and spur innovation. We do not need to burden our hardworking farmers and ranchers with onerous regulations and costly permit fees. And that's why adoption of S. 1475, the Bipartisan Livestock Regulatory Protection Act, introduced by Senators Thune and Sinema, is so important. This legislation makes clear that investment and innovation are the way forward, not command and control regulation. Our advancements in sustainability are due to adoption of technologies and farmers' terrific participation in voluntary, incentive-based conservation programs. U.S. farmers have enrolled more than 140 million acres in federal conservation programs. That's equal to the total land area of California and New York combined. I can tell you personally, our farms and our land are our heritage. Every farmer I know wants to leave the land, air, and water as well as our farm and ranch businesses, in better condition than we found them. To achieve that goal, Congress must protect agriculture from undue burdens and respect farmers and ranchers' ability to innovate and solve problems. We must ensure that short-sighted, knee-jerk reaction public policies do not threaten the viability and sustainability of our farms or the long-term resiliency of our rural communities. Americans have a new appreciation for the importance of agriculture after seeing empty grocery store shelves the last couple of years, some for the first time in their lives. When the pandemic hit, we were proud to assure America that the commitment of farmers and ranchers is unwavering. We are still farming. Please make sure that the public policy doesn't stand in the way of our ability to continue to fulfill what we see is a sacred commitment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. I would be pleased to answer any questions the committee might have.
Thanks, Mr. Van Wall. And Senator Merkley has asked for a chance to go ahead out of order. We're happy to do that, and so please proceed. After he asks questions, I think Senator Capito says Senator Ernst has made similar requests. I think you'll follow Senator Merkley, and then after that, Senator Capito, myself, and then we'll take it from there. Okay. All right. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Mosley, Senate Bill 2421 calls for the creation of wildfire smoke centers of excellence to leverage the capacity and expertise at universities to help address the challenge of wildfire smoke and its impacts. The work that's being done at the University of Oregon under the community-initiated project right now is essentially the pilot project for this. What are the benefits of centers of excellence model?
Thank you for that question. You know, the federal government supports research in a number of different ways, and as the ranking member pointed out, the STAR program is one key way that we support research in this space. Centers of excellence, however, are really useful in some very specific circumstances. And one is when you need to build new research capacity, and you need to build that research capacity that would be sustained over time. And because centers of excellence or research centers tend to be funded with more funds and over longer durations, you have the time to build the interdisciplinary partnerships you need to tackle complex problems, either among the academy or between the academy and practitioners. And our Center for Wildfire Research, Smoke, and Practice is focused on the latter, which is to build new relationships between academic researchers and communities that are seeking to tackle smoke at home. And we really want to be doing research that is driven by the needs of those communities and making sure that the research we do reaches those communities. And that's why something like a focused center of excellence can be so important to tackling these kinds of complex problems. We've seen them be very effective in climate change, transportation, and many other areas where we have wicked problems to solve. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And we have seen states taking some limited efforts to help address the challenge. For example, in Oregon, their environmental agency has provided a grant for the city of Ashland to set up an air purifier distribution program. In California, the state has launched a pilot program providing grants for smoke shelters, kind of a similar effort. Still, most places are no better prepared for unhealthy air this year than they were in 2020 or 2015, even as smoke becomes more and more of a problem. So, Doctor, what would be the benefit of providing dedicated resources to states to address the impacts of wildfire smoke?
Thank you for that. I think one of the things that we're grappling with in the area of wildfire smoke is that for many, this is actually more like a natural hazard than it is a traditional pollution, like a smokestack pollution. And so we need to have new tools to be able to tackle this problem, which is becoming very ubiquitous. We think of it, and communities that are frequently near fires see the problem of smoke very, very often. But for many places, smoke is maybe more rare. And but we need to tackle it across the country, right? As you said in your opening remarks, Washington, D.C. is downwind from many, many fires. And so there are the enormity of the range of communities that need to be prepared to provide clean air shelters similar to the cooling shelters or heating shelters that we provide for other kind of weather events is really critical. And so we need to have some focus in this space because it's really different than some of the other kinds of some of the other kinds of pollution that we face that we've been tackling through more traditional means.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and I'll yield back the rest of my time. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Senator Ernst, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Carper and
Do you have a
Chairwoman
bigger sign
Capito.
than that? Do you have a bigger sign?
Do we need bigger?
That's pretty big.
No, thank you so much for holding this hearing today, and for those that are here as witnesses. These are issues that are really important to our state of Iowa. And Mr. Vanderwall, I'd like to start with you, please. And just like you, I grew up on my family farm in southwestern Iowa, and I know how much pride that our family took in raising livestock and in crops. Our hardworking farmers and ranchers really shouldn't have to worry about overly onerous regulations coming from the federal government and, of course, the increased production costs that go along with that. So could you please speak to the impacts that previously proposed livestock emissions regulations would have had on your family's farm?
Well, thank you, Senator, for that question. And I think that's one of the most important points that we need to make, is that every time Congress puts a regulation or an agency puts a regulation on agriculture, it makes it more difficult for small families, farms and ranchers to survive. And in our operation, we only feed about 1,000 head of cattle, farm 2,000 acres. That's not big anymore. And when regulations come out that take more employees, more time away from managing the operation, that detracts from the success of the operation. So certainly those previous regulations would have been very difficult to manage, and like I said, a lot of smaller operations would probably just hang it up and quit.
Yeah, and then, of course, we talk a lot about the cow tax, but how would those burdensome regulations like the cow tax increase costs on both livestock producers and our consumers? More of the same, right?
Exactly, yes.
So I think this is something that is very important, obviously, to folks in Iowa and South Dakota, all across the Midwest, where we do have large livestock operations on sweeping through the South. But it is difficult for our small family farmers to really take on the burden of federal government regulations, again, that are overly onerous, and it does cause increased costs to our consumers. So, of course, I'm advocating not to pass a cow tax, of course. But I thank you for being here today. And then I do want to move on to the RPM Act as well. And Mr. Brown, thank you very much for being here and your family. Chairman Carper had made a comment about young boys that want to go into racing. And I said, and girls.
Yes.
And girls, yeah. So I grew up on a motorcycle. Of course, we had dirt bikes out on the farm. And my brother was an avid motocross racer when he was a young man. And my sister, we shout out to Adams County Speedway, county over from us. We used to go there on Saturday nights. My folks would take us over on dirt track racing.
Yes.
And that's the greatest place in the world to be on Saturday nights. And my sister tried her hand at powder puff racing as well. So we are a family that love motorsports. And I think, Mr. Walk, to your point, it is illegal. It's illegal to have those types of vehicles on the streets. But certainly, we want to make sure that it is okay to modify certain vehicles for the love of racing. So Iowa has about 34 dirt and asphalt tracks, and we love it. So that's about one for every 3 counties. And we host these races all throughout the year, and we bring drivers in, race teams in, and a heck of a lot of fans. And can you talk about what would happen if we did not have this legislation? What would happen to the industry if we didn't allow for those modifications?
Well, the thing about it is, just I could speak on my personal experience, is that if that legislation goes through, because we need it to be clear. And what I mean about is like, just like Chairman said too, is looking for a solution without a problem. And the hard part is let me just quote you something from EPA's legal briefing from a file of court in 2020. An EPA certified motor vehicle cannot become a non-road vehicle, even if it's used exclusively for competition. That was filed. And then another one in 2021 where the EPA says, is illegal regardless of whether the vehicle is exclusively for competition purposes. And if that's the case, that's why the certainty is so important, especially for me, because I see my kids coming up. I was that kid, just like you growing up as a kid, that went to a local racetrack and saw my hero and saying, this is what I want to do. That was a part of the American dream. And when I was able to see that, it gave me hope to be there one day. And I fulfilled that walk because I was able to take a standard motorized vehicle that I can afford, a motorcycle from a junkyard, and rebuild it and take it to the drag strip, and made my dream into a reality through those steps. And my kids are reaping that benefit where they're going through that same thing. They get out what they put in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This is, and when I look at that, when I see this, and I see notions like that, it's heartbreaking, because I see the girls and the boys that are coming up in the junior dragster ranks that's across this whole country, where I help race a league called the Midwest Junior Super Series, where we're actually helping these kids understand what it takes to become a professional and show them the grassroots levels on how to get there.
It's so great.
And being able to modify that and do those with those motor vehicles, that's the stepping stones and the building blocks for the next future professional racers tomorrow. Without that, there's no stepping stone.
Thank you so much. I
you.
appreciate that. Thanks to you and
you,
your
Senator.
family. Happy racing.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, Senator Ernst, we learned a few things about you here today. Senator Capito?
I'm going to let Senator Inhofe go before me.
All right.
Thank you.
I think you're kind to do that. Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I appreciate the really interesting thing that we're experiencing right now, and we're dealing. We even had some star power here that we're happy to have as part of it. So, Mr. Brown, as you know, the EPA is threatening to restrict America's ability to convert motor vehicles into racing vehicles. The recognizing the protection of the Motorsport Act would clarify that it's legal for car racers to convert to street vehicles into a dedicated race vehicle. The bipartisan legislation provides certainty to motorsports companies employing tens of thousands of American workers that produce and sell special parts that racers need to build. So you're the one who is really interested, and you're on the line on this thing, and you've done a very good job. And my kids will be very proud that we're spending this time together. So I would like to just have you characterize the type of people. You know, Oklahoma is a small state. We're a rural state. We are an ag state. And so I look at this and both of these bills that we're going to be talking about today as things that will be very helpful. They're kind of geared for Oklahoma. And so I'd just like to have you share a little bit about the mom and pop type of population that benefits the most from this, Mr. Brown.
That where the mom and pops benefit from this, you said, sir?
No, how they benefit, because we're talking about Oklahomans now. These are
Yes.
not giant corporations. These are mom and pop operations.
Yes. Well, the way they benefit is that, believe it or not, in our community of motorsports, our 1,500 tracks reach across the whole country, even in the small neighborhoods. Like I grew up in New Jersey, but I go to 22 different venues across the country in NHRA drag racing. And we go from all the way down there, like in Tulsa, have a racetrack in Tulsa, Oklahoma, all the way down to Dallas, Texas, Gainesville, Florida, and we go all the way up to Brainerd, Minnesota. We impact so many of the small grassroots people that come in, and we affect the communities just by generally just where, I'm not going to lie to you, I grew up on a 15-acre farm ground in the little town of Chesterfield, New Jersey, right? It's in the middle of nowhere. Like cattle up the road. I drove a combine. My family had an excavating business that we on the farm. And what we did is your do-it-yourselfers. So a lot of do-it-yourselfers back in those areas, this is actually who it benefits from because they work on their vehicles and they're the ones that are able to take it, where racing and motorsports, when you take it to the area where you're able to take that station wagon that your mom had, and you can actually modify it. It doesn't take a lot of money. And you could take it to your local drag strip. Where's a local drag strip in those little towns across America? And you can go there and spend $20, and you can actually race that vehicle.
Yeah, we're operating on limited time here, and I want to come back because I've been fascinated by your background and what it's meant to you. But I had one question I wanted to have Mr. Vanderwall. As you mentioned in your testimony, agriculture accounts for approximately 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, and livestock accounts for less than 4% of overall emissions. And I think John Thune did a good job of explaining what a cow tax would do and who that would affect. And so, Mr. Vanderwall, will you explain how passing the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act would keep food costs down for Americans buying beef and pork, and eggs, and egg products?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. That's very important because, like I said, food security is national security to our country. And the more times we put more regulations on our farms and ranches, it causes people to quit if they can't afford to follow those regulations or meet them, if they have to hire more people. And in turn, it reduces the supply, which increases prices to consumers. And so it's certainly in our country's best effort or best interests to use common sense and keep those regulations low. I talked about the fact that agriculture is doing such a good job already through innovation in the last, decades, and how we're doing things on a voluntary basis, always looking for a way to improve and doing the best we can. And we believe that's the way to go in the future.
But I really believe that we have an opportunity to yield to the pressures that are out there on overregulation. Overregulation is something that people don't understand until they are among those who are overregulated. Now, Mr. Brown, is there any other thoughts, even though we're running a little short of time, that you'd like to talk about the further economic impact that this legislation would have on states like my state of Oklahoma?
Absolutely, sir. One thing that I like to share too, in just our motorsports industry, throughout the whole country, we have over $100 billion impact on the communities and states across the country that motorsports resonates and goes to. So it's definitely a big impact from communities, just from hotels, from everything that's around it. So it has a huge impact, and also for the small business owners also that actually make these parts and pieces, and also for the development of future technology that goes into vehicles tomorrow. Like we always say in racing, that we're working on tomorrow's technology today, and that's a huge impact across the whole country.
That's a good point, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. You bet. I'm going to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record 2 letters dated September 6, 2022, in opposition to S-2736, the Recognizing Protection of Motorsports Act of 2021 as written, without objection. All right. Again, to our witnesses, thank you all for joining us. I mentioned right at the beginning of my comments that I spoke of what we're seeing in terms of weather across the country, floods, record floods. Not far from where my mom and sister live in eastern Kentucky, we've seen sea level rise all over the coast of our country. We've seen droughts, record droughts. In terms of agriculture, we've seen a lot of places where crops just aren't growing. And it's not just in America, but it's across the planet. One of if you look at the major cause of what's creating this, it's too much carbon dioxide in the air. And if you look at where does it come from? About 30% of the carbon dioxide emissions in this country come from the vehicles we drive, our cars, trucks, vans, motorcycles. I say that as a former motorcycle driver, owner. But the second greatest source is power plants. About 25% of the emissions come from power plants, and about another 20% from manufacturing operations. Think cement plants, think steel mills and that sort of thing. This is a serious matter, and the amount of damage, property damage, is in the it's not just millions, it's not just tens of millions, hundreds of millions. It's in the billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, like within this year. So this is serious. This is a serious matter. We got to make sure that we're looking at every significant source of carbon emissions, and that's why this is so critical. Mr. Walk, as you know, emissions from our transportation sector are a large contributor to the climate crisis and to smog, to air toxic pollutions that are dangerous to our health. I believe we can all agree that drivers should face a Clean Air Act liability for vehicles that are used solely for organized racing. EPA has never gone after, let me say that, EPA has never gone after race car drivers through its Clean Air Act enforcement actions and does not intend to do so in the future. But having said that, EPA is finding massive Clean Air Act violations as aftermarket parts are installed on cars and trucks that are used daily on streets in our communities. That means more asthma attacks, more lung disease, more mortalities, and somebody needs to be held accountable for these results. My question is this, Mr. Walk, what is your advice to us as lawmakers about who should be held accountable and how should we do that? Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Senator Carper. Well, we should not be holding race car drivers accountable. The minimal amounts of air pollution that occur on weekend driving racing is not the air pollution problem. It's the defeat device industry that is the problem. I understand and appreciate Mr. Brown's desire for certainty for himself, for his family, and race car drivers, and I think that's something that Congress can address through a narrowly tailored amendment. The problem is that the bill limits the ability of EPA to enforce against businesses who should have known their defeat devices were not being used on race cars. Now, I don't have his driving skills. I really wish I did. I have much less significant skills as a Clean Air Act attorney for 30 years. And if I were an attorney for the defeat device industry, I'd write language like this, because it says, no, we shouldn't ask whether people knew or should have known that their devices were not used on race cars. We should ask solely, what was your purpose in selling this? Well, they're going to say their purpose was to sell it to race car drivers. But as these enforcement cases have shown by the Trump administration and the Biden administration, they aren't able to prove those facts in actual cases. So we have hundreds of thousands of tons of illegal vehicles, hundreds of thousands of tons of illegal pollution, and it's my professional opinion that this bill would make things worse.
All right, thank you. I have another question. I want to go back to Dr. Mosley. I want to turn to wildfire events. And best climate science tells us that the conditions that are driving wildfires, including extreme heat and drought that I mentioned earlier, are getting worse, not better. This summer, at least 1/3 of Americans were under a heat advisory. 1/3. And tens of millions have experienced extreme temperatures surpassing 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's in a bunch of places where they don't even have air conditioning. At the same time, the historic extreme drought affecting the West is worsening and spreading east. It shows, as of yesterday, there are, I'm told, 69 active wildfires across our country, some as big as my state. And in July, that number was at least 82 wildfires burning at one time. My question, Dr. Mosley, is briefly tell us, do these startling figures reflect the reality you see on the ground? And in other words, do you agree that wildfires are becoming more frequent and intense due to climate change?
I think the scientific evidence is fairly clear that we have a number of drivers, not the least of which is climate change, that is increasing the size and severity of wildfire. As you say, we're seeing hotter, drier climates, particularly in the arid West. I think it's also important for folks to realize that we see a lot of wildfire on CNN or on cable news, but there is in fact a very broad array of what wildfire is and where it occurs. In this fiscal year to date, we've had more than 6 million acres burned in wildfire. Half of that occurred in the state of Alaska. 1 million of it occurred in the southern United States. So we have wildfire really everywhere, and what we really need to be thinking about as wildfire continues to grow, and I think the scientific evidence is also clear that we are not yet in a new normal. It feels like a new normal, but it is going to continue to grow for some time, even with our best climate mitigation measures. That more and more folks are going to need to be prepared for and learn to live with fire and fire smoke, and that's why adaptation, such as contemplated in the bills here, is so important.
Dr. Mosley, thank you. And now, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you all for being here today. The RPM Act, as I mentioned in my opening statement, this is the second hearing that over the last several years that we've had on something that to me seems like a simple, very common sense fix to we're saying that it's a problem, it's a solution in search of a problem, but we spent a lot of time trying to fix this problem. And there is a problem there. Mr. Brown, you've testified to that. And Mr. Walk has acknowledged that we need to have a fix here. So I guess my question to you, Mr. Brown, because you've been really explicit about talking about your youth and the STEM education, and you have your wonderful family there that's involved in racing, and I imagine that most of your audience are families that come out on an evening to an affordable way to enjoy being with their families and watching a great sport. But if a looming EPA lawsuit is looking over you, and you said you just created your new team, what kind of reaction do you have that as a small business owner? How would you ever be able to fight that?
That's the hard thing, and I agree with Mr. Walt on the purpose that speaking as a racer, that when I'm looking at the things from their standpoints, like, we are all against people with defeat devices. But the thing about it is that you don't have to come after the racers or the race teams, but if you go after legitimate companies that are producing race parts and they don't have the power to sustain, and you shut those small companies down, then it hurts the whole motorsports industry as a whole, because those companies were supplying legitimate race products to the racing industry. So I do agree that they should also have a deal of sale, where they actually have a record of sale, where they go, hey, this is what this part's for, this is where it goes at, and this is what it's used for. And if they have that categorized, that might help the solution to the problem. You follow me? So for me in general, it's like, it was like mind shocking, because like, hold up. Like, and you're seeing where our sport and where I live in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I came from New Jersey. And the reason why I moved there was because this was the race capital of the world. And then when you see things that comes down from the EPA, it actually puts a stronghold on that, where you can see it dissipating, going away from the outside in.
Right.
And as being a racer, we'll be the last ones affected by it when we don't have no parts and pieces to buy.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very good. Mr. Vanderwall, we also heard that the cow tax proposal, and there's really no need for this legislation because it's taken care of every year in appropriations. Well, I'm on appropriations. I wouldn't be betting on what's going to happen every year in an appropriations process here in the United States Congress. I mean, we're heading up to a continuing resolution, which is not the way that this whole system was conceived. We should have our appropriations bills in line by September 30th, have them passed, and have our wishes move forward. So a year-by-year Band-Aid is not, I don't think, a solution to the issue that you're talking about. How do you all feel about the every year having to fight, and some years more than others? That's got to be an issue for you.
Well, thank you, Senator. It certainly is. That causes uncertainty when we have to wait every year in anticipation of something that might happen in a bill or something that EPA might do administratively. It would be far, far better to have this in statute by Congress that would say the EPA does not regulate agriculture based on greenhouse gas emissions, recognizing all the things we've talked about. It would provide certainty for us going forward. And people could really concentrate on innovation and technology, and be able to work on those things rather than worrying about what the government might do in the next year, in the next round.
Well, I think you've stated the statistics that without something, as you're moving forward as an industry with the innovation and technology that's coming forward, you're able to bring your emissions down almost in a voluntary manner because it's good for the environment, it's good for the farmer, it's good for the consumer. And so I think putting our emphasis in those positive areas is a much more beneficial way than in a punitive way, such as a cow tax would put forward. So thank you for coming. Thank all the whole panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Capito. Senator Whitehouse, good to see you.
Thanks, Chairman. Let me start with offering a little bit of context. This comes from the National Institute of Science, I believe, and it shows the mammal creatures on the Earth measured out by biomass. And if you look here, you see that all the wild mammals on the planet amount to 4% of the biomass of mammals. From field mice to rabbits to deer to elk to tigers and elephants, all of them as mammals, 4%. Cattle alone are 35%. So there are 9 times as many cattle, at least by weight, there's 9 times as much cattle by weight as there is all of the wild animals, mammals, anywhere on the planet together. So what the cattle are doing out there obviously has big effects on our planet. Mr. van der Wal, you have said that livestock emissions make up less than 4% of overall emissions in the U.S. and that they're declining thanks to improvements in feed and production practices. You've said that U.S. farmers and ranchers have long been at the forefront of climate-smart farming, utilizing scientific solutions, technology, and innovations to raise crops and care for livestock, and that innovations include methane digesters and advances in nutritional balance that lead to lower per unit, and I assume there you mean per animal, GHG emissions. Could you just say a word about what the technologies and innovations are that are proving most effective in reducing methane emissions from livestock?
Well, thank you, Senator. Just to comment on part of your question, when I talk about—
Don't comment too long, because I'm on a clock here, so
Sure.
I'd really like you to answer my question.
I understand. What I mean by reduction in per unit is per unit of production. So like in a dairy cow, that would be per gallon of milk or per pound of milk.
Got it.
So in regard to emissions, the anaerobic digesters that people are putting in, that energy is being used actually to generate electricity for farms, those kinds of things, so we're not pulling on the grid. There are technologies such as varieties of corn that can be fed to livestock that are more efficient, produces less methane, greenhouse gases.
Do
and it's
algal
also
and
more
seaweed
efficient.
supplements do the same thing?
I'm sorry?
Do algal and seaweed supplements in feed do the same thing?
I can't answer that for sure. I'm not an expert on that.
All right. Well, I just wanted to flag for you that the Growing Climate Solutions Act was a very bipartisan measure. And as it gets implemented by the Department of Agriculture, my sort of nutshell version of it is that the equivalent of a farm agent can go out to a farmer and say, here's the stuff that you can do that will reduce either CO2 or methane emissions. And I've got the science behind me so that I can put a number on that. And then I can give you basically a good housekeeping seal of approval for those savings. And then you can take that and get credit for reducing your emissions. Is that the kind of incentive that you think the American farming community would welcome as we try to solve together the problem of climate change?
Yeah, certainly incentives are much better than a stick. If it's economically viable, or if somebody can finance it to show that it will be economically viable at some point, those are the things farmers are looking for. Certainly, we want to do the right thing for the right reasons, and we want to do that, these environmental things, because they're the right thing to do.
Well, the Farm Bureau supported it, and I appreciate that very much. And also, I just give Mr. Walk a chance to respond as he may wish in my remaining 30 seconds.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Just two clarifications. One, I just want to emphasize that the Clean Air Act permitting program that is the subject of the livestock bill imposes no emissions limitations, none whatsoever. So any discussion here of concerns over emissions limits and emission standards being imposed, they just don't arise under that program. It's a program to compile pre-existing requirements. There may not be any. And it also has some monitoring to provide for public awareness. The second clarification I'd just like to offer is that, as my testimony details in written form, EPA has never brought an enforcement case against a company that sells products just for racing cars. Okay, so what Mr. Brown is talking about, his suppliers are...
Would you say that again?
EPA has never brought an enforcement case against a manufacturer that sells products exclusively for racing cars. They are bringing cases against device manufacturers that are selling their products to the general public that end up on roads illegally in the hundreds of thousands.
All right,
so, Mr. Brown is buying products from, the top racing car companies, manufacturers in the world, and they have not been the subject of enforcement any more so than race car drivers have. None.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. And Senator Kelly, you're next. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got questions for both Mr. Brown and Mr. Walk. 14 questions, so we're going to go quickly, short answers, yes and no. But Mr. Brown, I'm trying to remember, did we meet at the track in Chandler, Arizona, or was it in Texas, or where was it?
I believe we met in Texas, in Houston, and I went to NASA Center.
Oh,
And I got
I
to
may
drive
have
over.
taken you in the simulator with Bob Tassin,
Yes,
maybe.
and I landed the space shuttle.
You
Bob
did.
didn't.
You landed the space. Let me clarify. You landed the space shuttle simulator.
Yes, not the real space shuttle, the space shuttle simulator.
All right. Well, I want to congratulate you on your. I saw that your best time and your best speed was at the track in Chandler, Arizona. So
Yes, sir.
congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I've got 6 questions for you, 8 for Mr. Walk in less than 4 minutes. So.
Okay.
In your testimony, you discussed how in your early days of racing, you converted a street legal motorcycle into a racing vehicle. You said it was used from a junkyard. How much cheaper was buying that vehicle as compared to purchasing a bike built for racing?
For racing, I would say probably I built that bike for $5,000, and a race vehicle of that nature would have been probably over $50,000.
And since this bike was used for racing, did you register your bike with DMV and get insurance for it?
No, sir.
So no insurance, no registration. As you know, some have raised concerns that there are bad actors out there who will buy a device built to be used for racing, but then will install it on a car that they use to drive on city streets. Do you believe that there are ways, such as asking a driver to show that they've canceled their vehicle's registration, which could help sellers and mechanics easily know that they're only selling parts to drivers for legitimate racing reasons?
Yes, I believe that will be where you can make it void, where it's not street legal no more at all, period. And most race vehicles are like that.
And then can you briefly talk about the process in California which allows racers to purchase equipment needed for their vehicles?
Yes, California being one of the most strict states out there, they actually have that part, like legislation where it excludes like race vehicles from all the normal that they do for normal motor vehicles that are on the road.
And I understand that there are some devices sold today which allow drivers to turn off and on and off the emissions control in a vehicle, or there are devices programmed to trick the computer when the vehicle has its emissions tested. Can you think of any reason that a racer might need a device that has these features?
No, sir, because when we actually strip all the vehicles, standard stuff out of it and put electronic EFI and everything to control everything that we do down the racetrack, which all the standard stuff will be null and void, what we need in a race vehicle.
Mr. Walk, I've got 2 minutes, and I appreciate your testimony on the RPM Act, and I had a, so let me just step through these. I want to start off with an easy question. Do race cars or street vehicles converted and used exclusively for racing have a measurable or meaningful impact on overall air pollution?
Not to my knowledge.
And given that, would you oppose a properly crafted, compromised version of the RPM Act which had guardrails to protect amateur racers and businesses whose goal is to serve amateur racers while going after bad actors?
Not drivers. I'd be very interested in see what the law said about businesses.
Would you agree that there are vehicle owners, mechanics, and parts sellers who legitimately want to modify vehicles exclusively for racing?
Yes.
In your testimony, you explained that EPA maintains that a device which defeats emissions controls is illegal regardless of how a motor vehicle is used. This means that EPA maintains that modifying a vehicle's emissions controls for racing is illegal, correct?
That is correct, and they have said they will exercise enforcement discretion, but that is not a legal exemption.
Does this also mean that EPA has not provided any regulations or guidelines to good faith vehicle owners, mechanics, or parts sellers explaining how they could avoid being subject to EPA enforcement actions related to the Clean Air Act?
EPA has provided numerous instances of that guidance and specific ones targeting the racing competition vehicle market.
So there is guidance.
There is.
All right. Would you be more likely to support the bill if EPA were required to issue regulations with a reasonable period of time before a racing exemption took effect?
I'm not fully understanding the question. The key is the statute and whether the statute is weaker before and after, and then EPA will issue regulations following the statute. And my testimony today has solely been about not weakening the statute as it applies to defeat device manufacturers and sellers.
Asking if there were, if in a reasonable period of time, if the EPA were required to have some clear, regulations, would you then be more likely to support it?
Sure, especially if they were targeted, if those regulations made clear that drivers like Mr. Brown were not covered by the law. I would support that 100%, and I've tried to be very clear about that.
Okay. And would you be more likely to support the bill if EPA were required to, in implementing regulations, describe documentation needed to ensure a vehicle would be used exclusively for racing?
The key to enforcement is placing the burden of proof on the defeat device manufacturers to show that their products are not being used in racing cars. And then if that standard is preserved in the law the way it has been for decades, EPA can write regulations with lots of additional guidance and information to help carry out that law.
Okay. I just got one more, Mr. Chairman. If clear implementing regulations are developed by EPA explaining how a parts seller or mechanic could comply with the Clean Air Act, would you agree that EPA should avoid applying a strict liability standard against a retailer or mechanic who is duped by a small number of bad actors?
Yes, that is not the law, and it has never been the law, and it should not be the law.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Padilla, you're recognized. Well, Senator Markey, welcome. And you're next in line. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I first of all want to thank Senator Merkley for his leadership in introducing both the Smoke Planning and Research Act of 2021 and the Smoke Ready Communities Act of 2021. It's not just the state of Oregon, not just the state of California, but it's the entire Western United States, but California in particular, that is all too familiar with the devastation caused by wildfires. Not just the fires themselves, I'm also referring to the smell and effects of wildfire smoke. But again, it's not just a California issue, it's not just a Western United States issue, because a lot of people remember, I know I got calls from my colleagues all the way to Illinois, even colleagues on the Eastern Seaboard last year, complaining about the air quality. Think about that, the air quality on the East Coast that was the result of wildfires burning in the West. So it truly is a national concern. Now, wildfire smoke is a complex mixture of air pollutants, clearly unhealthy to breathe, and it can be especially dangerous for children, for the elderly, for pregnant women, for anyone with heart or respiratory conditions. A recent Stanford University study found that single-family homes across the country tend to have 3 to 4 times higher particulate pollution during wildfire events than public health guidelines recommend. So my question is for Dr. Mosley. Given that time is of the essence with increasingly extreme and more frequent wildfires continuing across the West, how crucial do you think it is to enact these bills as quickly as possible to protect public health and better inform communities of the dangers posed by wildfire smoke?
Thank you for that question. Wildfire is growing so rapidly that for those of us who live in the West, you can almost barely imagine it. The fires in your state and mine have been just astonishing. And so the importance of taking action to protect people from wildfire smoke is increasingly urgent, not only in our states, but as you say, across the country as smoke, as we learn more and more about the negative impacts of smoke, as well as the rapid increase in the number of people in all walks of life who are affected by that smoke.
I appreciate in your written testimony your reference to equity concerns, how there's a disproportionate impact on lower income individuals, lower income communities. Mr. Walke, my home state of California has long been recognized as a national leader in the fight against the climate crisis and for our efforts to protect communities from toxic air and water pollution as well. California is also the largest agricultural state, home to a $50 billion agricultural economy and the largest dairy industry in the country. California's farmers and ranchers know better than most that our ability to feed the nation and to support family farmers and farm workers alike relies on clean air and clean water. That's why California is working to cut methane emissions by at least 40% by 2030 in partnership with farmers and ranchers as they transition to more sustainable manure management and emission reduction practices. Senate Bill 1475 would preemptively restrict EPA's authority, preventing the agency from considering policies to address the industrial livestock sector. To your knowledge, is there precedent for exempting entire industries from major components of the Clean Air Act?
No, certainly not in this manner. I was shocked to learn that agriculture emits more methane emissions in the United States than the oil and gas sector. And the vast majority of that comes from the digestion processes of animals. It's not a problem that we should be kind of permanently codifying into an exemption in the law. If we kick the can down the road with an appropriation rider, we can always change our mind. But if it becomes a permanent exemption from the Clean Air Act, my experience is it's just never going to go away, and we're never going to solve this problem.
So just to underscore the point, how important is the EPA's operating permit program to the ability of states like California to protect the public and support investments in smart, sustainable agriculture practices?
Well, the key to the operating permit program, and it's sometimes misunderstood, is really to just have some monitoring and reporting so that there's public awareness and some accountability, and that so the states and the federal government can get a handle on how much the emissions are from this industry. Right now, we don't know. There's nothing to require it. EPA was required by a court in 2005 to develop emissions estimation methodologies for concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. They are 17 years overdue. Now, they're supposed to come out with something this fall. I'm waiting, with bated breath to see what it will say. But we're just not taking this problem seriously, and unfortunately, a permanent exemption from the Clean Air Act is just not the right approach, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Padilla, good to see you. Thanks for joining us today. Senator Markey, how are you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm doing great. I hope you are as well.
Indeed.
Mr. Walke, as you know, factory farms produce immense quantities of waste that fuel climate change and pollute the surrounding soil, air, and water. According to a study conducted in 2021, simply living in proximity to a factory farm can decrease life expectancy. Rural, low-income, agricultural dependent, and black and brown communities are directly affected by these environmental hazards. Mr. Walk, do you believe that codifying this exemption for factory farm emissions, which is already regularly included in appropriations packages, would be beneficial to nearby communities?
No, Senator Markey, quite the opposite. I mean, one of the pollutants that the bill exempts is nitrogen oxide, which is a precursor to smog, and so that's a health hazard to communities surrounding these factory farms. This takes us backwards, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so it would not improve. In fact, it would harm those communities.
That is correct, yes.
Proximity. According to the EPA's latest greenhouse gas inventory, emissions from agriculture have continued to rise, while emissions from some other sectors have decreased, and these emissions are significant. For example, a recent report found that JBS, the world's largest livestock corporation with substantial U.S.-based operations, is responsible for more emissions than the whole country of Italy on a yearly basis. One company. So we just have to be realistic about it as we're waiting for Italy to come to Egypt in November. We should be inviting JBS as well in terms of what their plans are to reduce greenhouse gases. If corporate agriculture is given broad, permanent exemptions like those proposed in the Livestock Regulatory Protection Act, what prevents corporations like Exxon and Shell and BP from asking similarly large industry-wide exemptions? They'll say, well, you gave it to agriculture, why not give it to us as well? I mean, we only produce the same amount of emissions as JBS, so give us the exemption too. What would stop that from being the inevitable and exorable course that this whole discussion would take?
Nothing would stop that. I think it's just a matter of political muscle. We have 50 years of experience in this country to know that voluntary measures don't cut greenhouse gases enough to avoid a climate crisis, and we need to take that seriously with actual real measures.
Yeah, I think we should be heading, I agree with you, in the opposite direction in terms of what the requirements are going to be on companies that have been allowed to use the air as a large sewer to be sending up these very dangerous emissions. Robust air pollution standards are critical to protecting communities. The transportation sector is the largest contributor to climate pollution in the United States. Not a single year, over a single year in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic alone, more than 7,100 deaths were linked to pollution from vehicle emissions. Mr. Walk, in your testimony, you mentioned the extensive use of illegal defeat devices in diesel pickup trucks, which resulted in an additional 570,000 tons of nitrogen oxide and 5,000 tons of particulate matter. As you point out, this is quite alarming considering that all electric power plants in the United States released 780,000 tons of nitrogen oxide emissions last year. Those are crazy numbers. The use of illegal defeat devices is creating an easily avoidable threat to public health. Mr. Walk, does preventing the use of defeat devices and prohibiting tampering with emission controls protect environmental justice communities who historically bear the brunt from living in areas with dirty air?
Absolutely. We know they live closer to highways than a lot of the rest of us. And those figures you quoted were just from diesel pickup trucks, but there are a lot of other vehicles on the roads with defeat devices near where these low-income and black and brown communities live.
Yeah, so these are crazy numbers. Again, all electric power plants in the United States released 780,000 tons of nitrogen oxide last year, and just the diesel pickup trucks is 570,000. So, you know, we've got to work harder and smarter here, and just look at JBS, you know, and look at what it does compared to, you know, other industries, and the same thing is true here with the diesel pickup trucks and the other issues that we're trying to deal with. And we just have to get serious. And we can do it because we are a technological giant in the United States. That's our strength. That's who we are. And we only, you know, we only lose our opportunities when we allow for our greatest strength to be offshored. We'll wait for some other country to start producing chips for us, or solar panels, or wind turbines, right? Rather than saying, no, we're going to do it here. And so that's where all of these technologies that will be the solutions, have to be developed, and we have to say, we'll go first, and then the rest of the world will follow. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your great leadership on all these issues. Thank you for this.
And thank you for being a great partner over all these years. Senator Capito, is she going to be coming back? Okay, all right. I think she and I talked. I think she may have just a few words to say in closing. And it's been an interesting hearing. This is our first hearing back. We've been an August recess, so a lot of times we don't have an August recess. We did last month after we finished quite an active period of time here in the Senate and the House. But this is a good hearing to come back on, and we're grateful to each and every one of you for your presence. Some of you have been before us before, some not, but we're grateful for your presence and your participation today. I think a big part of why I've had some success in my life, I like to say, my sister and I picked the right parents in a coal mining town in Beckley, West Virginia. They instilled in us core values that I carry around with me to this day and have served me well in my life. You could probably think of core values that your parents instilled in you, but among those were hard work, golden rule, treat other people where you want to be treated, and trying to figure out what's the right thing to do and just do it. Our hearing today reminded me of something that my dad used to say to us a lot. My dad was a chief petty officer in the Navy, World War II, Korean War, and for about 30 years after that. And he would say to my sister and me when we were little kids growing up, we're born in West Virginia, grew up in Virginia, but he'd say to my sister and me when we'd pull some boneheaded stunt, he was always saying, just use some common sense. You could probably think of things your parents said. He said it a lot. We must not have had much common sense. But using common sense means that we need to do more to protect Americans from the impact of climate change and of unhealthy air. Mr. Brown and Ms. Brown, it was a pleasure to meet your sons, who I think, what are they, 14 and 18? So, yeah, 14 and 18. Our sons, our biological sons, are about a generation older, 32, 34. We always have worried about them growing up just to make sure they didn't get in an accident, whether they're on a bicycle or car or whatever, always worrying about them. And but we want to make sure they had a chance to grow up and grow old. And your boys, hopefully they'll have a chance to grow up and grow old. The greatest threat to their generation is frankly our planet's on fire, and it's getting worse, and it's getting worse faster rather than not. That's the bad news. I would just say, my colleagues hear me do this probably more than I ought to. I always like to think like, how do we have good, clean air, clean water, do something real about climate change? How do we do it? Create economic opportunity and jobs. That's my focus. I'm an old governor, and I'm always trying to figure out how do we create a nurturing environment for job creation and job preservation. As it turns out, in the legislation that we passed a month or so ago, Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot in it that deals with clean air and climate change. But we made a very clear connection between doing the right thing for our planet, for the people of us who live on our planet or growing up on our planet, doing the right thing for them, but also making sure that they'll have jobs and creating literally like millions of good-paying jobs going forward. That's critical. The question is, can we do both? Can we both look out for our planet, provide for our kids going forward, and making sure that not only they have clean air, clean water to drink, and don't live in a planet that's on fire, but have good jobs, good paying jobs. So one of our challenges is to how do we realize that? How do we realize that potential and make it happen? In Delaware, we raise a lot of chickens. And we have some from cows, but mostly we have chickens. For every person, Senator Capito, for every person who lives in Delaware, there are roughly 300 chickens. And they provide a lot of food for people in our state and around the world, but they also create a lot of manure, chicken manure. We empty out our poultry houses on a fairly regular basis. We used to put it out in the farm fields. It would rain and up into the streams in Chesapeake Bay and places like that, the inland bays in our state. Not good. Not good. We've gotten smarter about doing that, but we still have a lot of runoff on the Delmarva Peninsula that degrades the quality of water. One of the smartest ideas I've seen, and I'll relate this back to poultry, one of the smartest things I've seen in terms of looking for a market solution to help protect our planet and our air and all, is I saw it out in California. I like to do customer calls, visit businesses large and small all over the country. And in California, you've got a bunch of technology businesses, as you know, that are especially interesting. I visited one in the Bay Area where they take cow manure and they mix it with food waste, and they create a renewable form of gas that can be used to power large trucks and vans and buses. What a great market solution. We're trying to seize on the same approach on the Delmarva Peninsula, to where we take chicken manure and maybe food waste as well, and through a process called, I think, anaerobic digestion, to be able to transform that into something that actually has market value. The other thing is Senator Capito, and I know we supported legislation that came out of the Ag Committee a year or two ago on regenerative agriculture, trying to encourage farmers to put back into the soil, topsoil especially, carbon dioxide components that will increase the quality of the soil, the richness of the soil, increase yields. And we have legislation that's designed to provide an economic model to incentivize that. So there's a bunch of good ideas out there, and we need more. We need more. But the last thing I would say, as we discussed today, that means more actions to protect Americans from deadly wood smoke, which now blanket our western states all too often to extreme wildfires driven by climate change. It also means using common sense to ensure race car drivers at Dover Downs may continue to race, while cars and trucks we use on our streets and highways meet their pollution standards. They're good citizens. I may have driven my old Chrysler Town & Country minivan around the racetrack at Dover Downs, but that doesn't make it a race car. That should be exempt from emission standards. And with that having been said, I look forward to further conversations with Senator Capito, with our colleagues on these and other matters. Before we adjourn, Senator Capito, any last closing statements, please?
I'd just like to thank the witnesses. I think we've gotten a broad view of things. We have a lot of common area here. And now that the chairman, I have a visual of him driving around a racetrack in a minivan. That scares me. And then we're leading into lunch, and he's describing what we're going to be doing with our cow manure. So in all seriousness, these have been very serious topics. There's a lot of things at stake here. So I just appreciate everybody being here with us, and thank you so very much.
Before I do, just a tiny bit of housekeeping and a close on a lighter note. When my minivan reached 600,000 miles, a fellow who does yard work for a bunch of homes in our neighborhood always said he wanted to buy my minivan. If I ever sold my minivan, he wanted to buy my minivan. So finally, the day came, ordered an electric vehicle, came in, and red car, and he said, "Would you sell me your minivan?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "How much?" I said, $1. He said, "How much?" I said, "No, $1." He said, "Oh, that's not enough." I said, "No, $1." So we drove to the DMV, got there, took a number, sat down. Finally, they called the number and called us up to the desk. And the lady who was in charge, she said, "Oh, Governor, how are you doing?" Because I used to be governor. She said, "Oh, thinks of me as her governor," which is nice. She said, "Governor, how's your minivan?" And I said, "Funny, you should ask. My minivan's better known than me in Delaware." But she said, "How's your minivan?" I said, "Well, funny, you should ask her. I'm going to sell it." And she said, "To whom?" And I reached over to Eric right here. And she said, really? She said, you have the title? I said, yes. She said, well, how much are you going to sell it for? I said, $1. She said, how much? I said, $1. She said, well, right on the back, 1.00. You sign it, he signs it. So he signed it, gave it to her. She said, there's a transfer fee. And I said, how much is that? She said, 3%. I said, how much would that be then? She said, well, 3 cents. And I reached into my pocket, pulled out a nickel, and gave it to her, and I said, keep the change. Keep the change. All right. A little bit of housekeeping. Senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, September 21st, 2020. We will compile those questions. We'll send them to our witnesses, ask our witnesses to reply by Wednesday, October the 5th of this year. And again, there's been some humor in today's hearing. These are serious matters. And I know that you realize that. And together, hopefully we can come to good conclusions, good outcomes, so that Mr. and Ms. Brown, those boys of yours, will someday be sitting here before us testifying again 50, 60, 70 years from now and trying to keep our country on the right path. With that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.